Welcome everybody. My name is Mark Upton from My Fastest Mile, and my usual partner in crime, Al Smith, is with me today. Al.
Afternoon.
Afternoon. And our guest today is none other than Andrew Wilson. And Andrew, I'll give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about yourself and your background.
Thanks. Well, thanks for having me. So I'm a psychologist based at Leeds Beckett University in Leeds in the UK, and I study perception and action, skill acquisition and learning, but I do it from an ecological perspective, from the ecological approach, using dynamical systems and affordances and some of these ideas you may or may not have encountered. And so my research is about trying to make those things sort of scientifically make sense of some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Andrew, we've had some good chats in the last 8 months or so since I've been over in the UK, and it's they're really interesting. You tend to go off down a rabbit hole a little bit, back up for a while, and then think, what does this all mean from that applied practical point of view? So maybe we'll probably simulate a bit of that today quickly and cover something. So this is probably going to be aimed at potentially the more perhaps theoretically minded in the coaching world, as well as we'll try to I think it will be highly relevant for any students in sports science, motor learning, skill acquisition, obviously. So yeah, that's what we're pitching for people listening today, and whether it's worth staying tuned in. What we thought, Andrew, would be a good start is to hopefully I'll share my screen and just share a video clip we've got of a certain situation in a football game. If people can't end up seeing this, we'll embed this on our blog along with this hangout, so you'll be able to watch it under your own control if this doesn't work. So what we've got here, I'll play this clip out, and I'll just narrate over the top of it. So it's just an ISO cam of Frank Lampard when he was playing for Chelsea. So he's looking around, movement off the ball, lots of scanning, receives the ball, few touches, fake. And then pass the ball off. So I mean, these actions obviously in a sport like football, but could relate to basketball, could relate to hockey, netball, Aussie rules, a number of these invasive sports. That is quite common situations, and you've got a player basically navigating through a very dynamic environment and trying to achieve functional solutions. So I thought a good start, Andrew, would be maybe to compare and contrast a bit what we might call more traditional cognitive psychology or theory to what's going on there, and then you've already mentioned your interest and research is on the ecological side and what the ecological side might have to say about it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the standard sort of cognitive psychology, motor control kind of way of explaining that sort of behavior is looking at it in terms, like, as a sequence of events that have to, like a sequence of things that have to happen, a lot of which is happening internally, right? So he has to scan his environment, he has to identify gaps, he has to make decisions about whether or not to kick through those gaps or try and get himself through those gaps. He has to identify and maybe decide whether or not and how he's going to interact with teammates, etc. So there's always this process of sort of identifying the situation, selecting from a large repertoire of activities. Like, he's a highly skilled player, he's got a lot of things that he's capable of doing, right? And the idea is that he somehow has to flick through all of those and find the one that he's going to do now, and then he has to implement that somehow. So he has to decide to find the thing, he has to pull that map out and then implement that movement, fine-tune it a little bit with regards to the current sort of space. And so it's all the language is very computational, all the description, all the things you'd go looking for. It's all about decision making and action selecting and pulling things out, identifying the thing that you're going to do out of your repertoire that you have stored somewhere. This is kind of the idea. So it's a memory problem, for example. You have to access these memories from somewhere, and then there's all kinds of questions that you ask about where those memories live, etc. And so, you know, people have been doing this kind of analysis of complex movements for a long time, right? The contrast, I guess, from the more ecological perspective, the big focus in the ecological approach is perception. And the idea is that perception is actually a place or a process where huge amounts of that decision-making work happens and can happen. So instead of having to bring in a little bit of information on board and somehow think of it, not consciously, but think about it and do sort of a selection process, the idea is that we are engaged with and embedded in our environments, and we are perceiving the possibilities for action within that environment, what Gibson called the affordances, and we can talk about those a little bit as well. In contrast, then, right, the ecological approach, the big focus in the ecological approach is on perception. And the idea is that perception is actually a process that can do a lot of that work. It's the place where a lot of that sort of decision making, for example, kind of happens, as opposed to having to bring everything on board and do all the processing inside. And so the idea is that we don't sort of perceive, we don't just perceive gaps or people or distances, but we perceive opportunities for activity, opportunities for actions, these things called affordances. And the idea is that these are the opportunities that the current task environment are offering you in terms of things that you can do. And to a skilled observer, you don't get this for free. There's a lot of training involved. To a skilled observer, you know, a gap between two players, for example, as it ebbs and flows in size, affords being passed through at some point versus not, etc. And the idea is that perceiving the world in those terms provides you with direct information about exactly what it is you're supposed to do right there and then. And so the idea is that you don't have to go look up a repertoire of actions. What you do instead is you simply engage and interact with the world the way you have previously learned to engage and interact with the world. And so the idea is that instead of the brain kind of pushing behavior out, behavior is drawn out of you by your interaction with the environment. Think about it that way.
Mm-hmm. So again, in the more information processing approach, they tend to take these very discrete serial steps: input, process, output, or in coaching to perceive, decide, execute, or act, which can still give an impression that, as you're engaged in some Twitter debate over the weekend, maybe we can work on these elements in isolation. But is it true to say they're acting in isolation, or actually is information and action tightly coupled and it's sort of all going on at once in a melting pot?
Yeah, the whole thing is much more loopy, right? So it's you're perceiving the environment, and that's creating opportunities for you, but you're also you're using those opportunities to control your movements through the environment. But as you move, the opportunities change. As other people move, the opportunities change. So these things are in a relationship that unfolds over time. And so, yeah, it's all a bit more complicated and loopy than that. And actually, there's a very real sense in which and some people make quite a big deal out of this, actually, is that, like, it's often not sensibly possible to decompose an action down into its constituent parts. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. And one of the tricks is trying to tell the difference. As a general rule of thumb, though, actually, it's actually really difficult to break these things down. And so in the context of training, for example, what do you teach people? That's where that launches into that whole debate and that whole question of, can you train those isolated components and expect that training to transfer into the full context? Sometimes, maybe, sure, but probably not always, and probably not as the rule. That would be sort of an idea that would come out of this, right? But it's very much, the idea is that behavior is not something that you store away and then spit it out on demand. Behavior is something that's constructed in the moment, in real time, as a function of your interaction with the environment. And so it's literally emerging. It is literally being created in the moment, supported by the presence of information about the environment.
Absolutely. And I think that's the big, maybe conceptual leap that I think is missing in these discussions. It's a huge leap to take.
It is.
My own experience as well is I still sometimes fully understand it, because it's so easy to go back. We store these skills. So we have a kicking skill stored away, we refine it,
Yep.
Then we can add context. So people don't disagree with context, but it's hard, as you say, it's this emergence idea, isn't it? That the actual movement emerges in the moment due to, if we use constraints language, the constraints of the task.
My hunch over the years is that the basic suspicion about the idea of about behavior getting created in the moment is that you can actually, in similar conditions, produce similar behaviors. And so that there is this stability. There does seem to be this sense that you've brought with you a thing that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same situations presented with the same sort of requirement, you can output the same behavior. And so there seems to be this sense that, well, you have to have brought something along with you. And the answer is, yeah, you have, right? But you haven't brought with you the ability to execute the skill. What you've brought with you is the ability to interact with a task, to perceive and interact with the demands of a task. That's what you've brought with you. Learning is about learning to perceive tasks and task demands. And so, and the the reason why this works, the reason why there's this disconnect, for the longest time, and still in many sort of forms of psychology and sports science, has just been working under the assumption that perception is flawed. Perception is messy and noisy and ambiguous and full of illusions and problematic and all these kinds of. And if perception is like that, then you can't expect reliable behavior to come out of perceiving the environment.
Yeah.
Gibson's big move, and the ecological approach's big move, is to say, no, if you look at it carefully, if you ask some careful questions, then it turns out that perception is robust. It is rich. It is strongly constrained by the dynamics of the task, and there are vast amounts of deeply informative information that we are very sensitive to and can learn to use, and that in the presence of the task, if you're using that information to organize your behavior, and you're in a task that presents you with that information, then you can just organize that behavior again and again and again. And as long as the information is there, i.e. as long as the task demands are there, then you're good to go, right? And as long as Frank Lampard, when he's ducking and diving and dodging and all these kinds of things, he's not calling up a set of skills. He's reenacting his ability to perceive the affordances of a task, and those affordances are coming in and out of view for him as they get offered by the environment.
And that Lampard clip is a nice one, because at one stage he goes to shoot, so he starts to execute, if you like, where his behaviour's emerging, but then he pulls out of the shot because.
And look how fast it was.
Yeah.
It was fast. It was fluid. He didn't make a mistake. He just changed. The information just started. He's being pulled in one direction by the information, by his perceived environment. His perceived environment changes, and so his behavior is just pulled in a different direction. And he's good enough that when he's pulled in that different direction, he doesn't sort of literally lose balance or become sort of lose his composure. That's part of what expertise gives you, is that in that particular dynamic context, he's very good at coping with getting pulled around like that. But and that's not to say that he's not bringing huge amounts to this, right? Not everybody plays football that well, and that's fine. So it's not that he's not contributing to this. But the environment, his ability to interact with the environment, is doing big chunks of the work in shaping what his behavior looks like at any given moment in time.
Yeah.
And his job is just to get really good at detecting and perceiving that environment and then producing appropriate behavior. And that's the thing that takes. That's why he spent more time on it than I have. That's why he plays football better than me, right?
We assume. Probably a safe bet, mate.
Yeah, as a Kiwi, I think it's a pretty safe bet to say I do not play football.
We taught rugby all right, though.
Yeah.
That's a good opportunity too. You did touch on it then, but maybe to make explicit then this difference between cues and information, or direct perception, maybe.
Yeah. So a lot of the discussion is based, in terms of the way people talk about perception, is based around the idea of cues. So this comes from and a cue is a hint or something that's suggestive, right? A cue to distance is something that you can use as information for distance, but it's not very good and it's a bit rubbish, and you might need to supplement it with a different cue. So the idea about cues is that this is what perception has to work with, is that it's ambiguous information that's sort of kind of useful as long as you make some assumptions or use some other information to tie it all together. And so the idea is that this is why all the hard work happens in the head for the sort of the traditional approach, is because the hard work has to happen in the head, because all the hard work is involved in bringing these cues together. People talk about cue combination, and you have to weight those cues and pick them, which one to rely on the most, etc. And so that's where all that sort of discussion comes from. So a cue is an ambiguous piece of information that you pick up and use to make an educated guess about what it is you're supposed to be doing. In the ecological approach, the word information has a fairly particular sort of technical meaning. And information is its patterns in light or sound or any other energy array that we're sensitive to. And those patterns are created by the way those energy medium interact with the world. So the way light bounces off surfaces structures that light in such a way that has to do with the color, the size, and the shape, and the location in space, and all those kinds of things. I guess, to be honest, the clearest way to think about this in a sporting context, right? It's always hard to think about how these things scale up from sort of a static, just looking at an object kind of idea. One thing actually, and I think I should send you some links actually to put on the blog, the place to go looking for really good examples of what this information looks like is in point light displays of biological motion. Okay, so actually there's a great lab, a Canadian lab does sort of biological motion research, and they've got a lot of demos on their website we can send some links to. But the idea there is that a point light, excuse me, a point light display is where you place sort of reflective markers on each of the joints of whatever it is you want to measure, and then you record that, and then you simply play back the motion. So you get a little dot on the screen, and you use that to just play back the motion, but you strip out all the other information. So you don't get to see my hair or my skin or my clothes, or all you see is the movement. And the idea is that if you just present somebody with just this motion information, what can people do with it? And it turns out that actually, well, that motion isn't random. It's not ambiguous. That motion, the motion that comes off me, is very complicated and very high-dimensional, but it's very, very lawfully structured by the fact that it came off me and the fact that I'm built in particular ways, right? My arms only bend in certain ways. They move with certain frequencies and certain preferred rates because of how much they weigh. My legs are everything's organized in a very, 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 very specific way, and that's what we refer to as the dynamic, right? The way in which my body changes its position over time, that characteristic way that happens is its dynamic characteristics. That dynamic creates then these particular patterns of motion, of change. And these particular patterns of motion are ecological information. And it turns out, when you go asking people, people are A, exquisitely sensitive to these patterns, and B, these patterns are richly informative about all kinds of things. So if I recorded somebody walking and just presented you with the point light walker, if you look on the lab demonstrations, you can judge sex, age, a bunch of different emotional states. You can assess whether or not someone is currently vulnerable to attack. That's one of my favorite ones, right? Someone's walking along just by the motion, the way in which their body is moving. People get reliable sort of, you literally just perceive it, right? You don't see the motion and have to figure it out. The motion is directly used as information for the thing that created the motion, namely a moving person. People move in particular ways. And that's true of everything. Stuff happens in the world for non-accidental reasons, right? Stuff just doesn't happen one thing after another. Stuff happens for particular reasons that have to do with how things are made, how things are built, how they're hooked together. That's dynamics, right?
And so, Andrew, how does then, so the other argument, if that's the right word, is that people will say, particularly say young kids, 4, 5, 6, learning football skills or any sport, they'll compare it to things like reading and maths and say you've got to be explicitly taught, it's got to be broken down.
Yeah.
It's just how different, and maybe particularly talking about, for example, in sport, it's about movement.
Right.
In an environment, reading and maths is clearly not that sort of task. That may be wrong, but just talk about that for a minute. Why it's probably not a good argument.
Right. So, first of all, learning even something like maths and reading and all those kinds of things is also probably one of those skills that actually requires ongoing interaction and a fairly kind of dynamic sort of interplay. It's the kind of thing that, like, it is actually, if you start breaking it down and decomposing it, you can throw things off. And so that's a whole other sort of argument. But in terms of its relationship to learning, say, a motor skill or a movement skill in a sporting context, in particular in motor skills, right? So all the work in the ecological approach is really primarily about the perceptual control of action. That's where all the empirical work is really kind of cracked on. Like we're working on extending and expanding that, but that story is much more complicated right now. So at the very least, and actually, so that makes it, though, the things that we do know quite well are fairly relevant to a sporting context. The thing about a sporting context, right? So what are you learning? If learning is primarily a perceptual question, then your job as the learner is to come into an environment, a task, and you want to learn to be able to perceive your environment in ways that match what you're going to encounter in a game environment, because that's in a game environment, the game environment is going to offer you certain affordances, certain opportunities. Your job is to be able to learn to perceive those. So the goal of training should be to try and overlap with that as much as possible. And so the idea there would be that you have to really focus on the idea that you're trying to train perception. You're trying to create the opportunities for the environment to create information that will in fact show up in a game environment. And whereas in the context of maybe teaching something like maths or reading, that's not quite what you're trying to do, right? If you're trying to teach reading, you're not actually trying to teach flexible behavior in a highly dynamic and varied environment, actually. So there is an element, you can decompose it down, you can sort of teach sort of individual words, letters, you can get some of that sort of baseline stuff. But once you think about, even as a skilled reader, right, when I read text, I'm not reading individual letters and putting them together as words. I'm reading words and phrases, right? So I've actually, by my interactions and my ongoing interactions, I've actually learned to perceive that text in a particular way, and then organize my behavior with respect to it. So frankly, it's at this point, it's very unclear that there's any particular lessons to be learned for sporting context from some of these other topics, other than the general things we know about learning. Distributing learning works better than massing practice, etc. Like those sort of things seem to hold no matter what domain you're talking about. But other than that, in the context of a dynamic and sporting environment, where what you want people to be able to do, what they have to be able to do in order to be able to achieve anything, is they have to learn how to perceive the environment so that they stand a chance of learning which behaviors they can start to coordinate and control in response to those perceived task demands. And if they don't get exposed to that information, if they don't get exposed to a situation that creates that information, then it's not there to be learned. And so there's just that, there's a bit of there becomes that potential then for a real disconnect, right? And that seems to be what happens as soon as you start decomposing these tasks down into their elements. Sometimes the information is produced by the fact that all those things have been strung together over time, for example.
Mm-hmm. Al, anything on your mind?
I get what's interesting for me then is to flip to the complete opposite of that, and situations where there's creativity and abundance in learning, maybe where kids are learning to express themselves in playful ways, or even formally through drama or the arts, as a learning task, and how they're organizing themselves in that task, to me seems like it should be the kind of thing we're at least as interested in, if not more interested in a sporting context. But I'd be curious to hear a reflection on just those kind of polar opposites.
I mean, to be honest, they might. I think those kinds of environments are a little bit more dynamic. They require a little bit more dynamic, flexible, responsive kind of behavior, right? Whereas, if you think about reading's a fairly constrained activity, right? There's quite a bit to do, but in terms of the demands, it's fairly constrained, and you're not typically expected to demonstrate your reading prowess in a wide variety of circumstances. What do? You sit down with a book, right? Whereas all those other things that we're talking about, sports and dance and performing arts and of any kind, it's automatically an environment that's constantly changing, but not changing in a random way, right? There's structure to that change, and that structure that can be quite extended over time. But it's not random, but it is dynamic, it is changing. So you'd expect them to be sort of more interested in, how do you train people to be good at acting, right? You don't learn acting by sitting down and practicing saying one line at a time, right? When you're rehearsing plays, I did some drama when I was a kid. When you're learning plays, you actually just you jump into it, right? The reading is the whole thing, right? You don't just you don't spend huge amounts of time on the individual elements unless there's like a particular phrase that has to be said in a particular way, which is simply just not often the case, right? So the nature of the practice actually in something like theater, for example, or dance, right? It's already pretty geared towards the producing over and over again the bigger context. And that's how people can learn so many lines, right? It's because they're not learning individual things; they're learning contexts, I guess, and how to interact in that context. And a play is quite interesting because it's quite a complicated and high-dimensional sort of context, but it's one that you then repeat. Whereas a football game, the basic structure of it is there's quite a lot of it that gets repeated week to week, for example, but the huge variation in the details. So it's kind of, you go from reading down here to something like doing a play sort of in the middle where there's quite a lot of variation, but that repetition, that variation rather then just gets repeated as you do the play, through to never exactly repeating, but still not random, right? A football game is distinctly a football game. It's clearly not a rugby game, right? So there, even though every time you do a game they're different, it's still the same kind of thing.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the, back to coaching context, that's certainly one of the debates at the moment. There's clearly is structure in a football game, and again, if we go from all invasive sports, actually have similar structure at certain levels, but then become more specific to the certain sport. But then it's a balance between that structure, yet, as you said, every game or even every moment is at some level of analysis different from what's gone on before. And so the challenge, I think, for coaches is, at the moment, is trying to find that right balance, and back in some of the stuff Al and I talk about or are exposed to, one of the dangers with the too much analysis at the moment is we become too structured, so we think we can predict the future, if you like, too far in advance with too much precision and say, well, just do that, when in fact there's still that great need to perceive the affordances in the moment, because we're back to then behaviour or affordances that emerge in the moment.
I mean, I always think back, so like when I lived in the States, right, all my friends were American football fans, and so I learned about American football, and it's a weird game to me because it's actually quite rigid and quite structured, and they do have playbooks where they literally go, I'm now going to do this specific sequence of things, and so that kind of works in that context. But then I also think about the players that everybody really liked and really were amazed by, like all the quarterbacks, Brett Favre and Culpepper and Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning's a great example, right? Peyton Manning, the reason why everybody liked Peyton Manning is because he thought on his feet, right? Like he had that skill set that was required, that basic skill set where he could execute the play. But the point was that the thing that made him smart and the thing that made him such a good quarterback was his deep responsiveness to his environment, right? Where he could change up what he was doing as a function of what was happening, and that created for him this level of control over his situation, which meant that he just then was the amazing quarterback, and still is the amazing quarterback that he is, right? But that's why he was good, even in a sport that's like American football, that really is actually, you can literally playbook it out. Like the really amazing players, like no one ever looked at Peyton Manning and said the reason he's an amazing quarterback is because he's got such a perfect spiral. They've all got perfect spirals, right? But so, like, the reason he was an amazing quarterback was his decision-making to flexibly shape his behavior under the current conditions of the game, right?
So that ties in, actually. Was another article that we'll link to in the blog, comparing some of these expert decision-makers, if you like, and they were using the example or trying to compare with leading clinicians who can diagnose an X-ray quickly. And again, for me, you've got two vastly different things. One's very static, as in the X-ray film ain't changing whilst you're looking at it. And the other is you're not, other than picking up the film, putting it down, again, you're not actually physically acting on the information. Well, certainly not in the immediate moment anyway.
It's funny, I've been thinking about it. That's all true, but at one level, it's like the task facing the quarterback is, at one kind of thing, the same task as the one facing the radiologist. It's pattern recognition. It's just that the patterns that the quarterback's up against are dynamic, moving, changing patterns. They're not random. There's structure to them. It's just that structure is more complicated. It's kind of higher order, if you like, but it's still pattern recognition, right? So the funny thing about the radiologist thing is you can train a pigeon to do it, right? There was a paper that just came out. Everybody got very excited. You can train a pigeon to do the radiologist task pretty well. Why? Because pigeons are really good at visual discrimination of patterns, right? You can train, like, it's a surprise, people have been doing this to pigeons for years, but it's a pattern discrimination that's within their capability. It's still a complicated problem, but you can train them to do the discrimination. But they're also, the reason they can do that is that pigeons as well can also do more interesting, more complicated pattern recognition. Well, they have to be able to, because these guys locomote around the world and they fly and do all kinds of complicated things. So they have to be sensitive to those sort of patterns as well. But there is an issue of, those problems aren't different in kind, I guess, but there's a very real sense in which they are very different in amount or difficulty, right?
And can you talk actually about, so if we talk something like dorsal and ventral stream. So vision for action versus vision perception, or knowledge of, not knowledge about. And again, it's unlikely it's actually separate. I think actually recently there was a discovery that a missing bit of the brain that actually connects them. Surprise, surprise, everything's more connected than we maybe originally thought.
Almost as if that was always going to be there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's so right. So the dorsal and ventral stream thing is interesting, right? So anatomically, if you look at a brain, there really is a bunch of stuff that goes this direction and a bunch of projections that go this direction. And anatomically, there really are those distinctions. That's the first thing. That's fine. Then the question is, well, what's the function of those, right? And so then people started looking at clinical cases where people had selectively gotten damage to one part or another part, and you start identifying that you do get certain patterns of deficits. But here's the thing, those patterns are always messy, they're always complicated, they're never as clean-cut as they're reported in the literature. And also, frankly, if you go into the literature, there's 9 different ways of splitting that up, right? The dorsal ventral anatomical thing to at least half a dozen different functional distinctions, right? It's the what system versus the where system. It's the who system versus the how. It's the perception versus perception. It's like, so first of all, no one can actually fundamentally agree what those functional distinctions actually are. And the reason they can't is because the data is untidy, and it depends on the question that you ask the person that you're studying. So I don't, like, in terms of practice, I don't think there's anything practical out of that other than, well, it's just a fact of sort of human brain that they have this, but that's kind of not the point, right? In an intact human brain that you're trying to train to play football, you're not. There's no point in trying to feed information selectively to that bit of the brain, or using the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere. No, here's the thing, the whole thing, and the normal intact adult brain is humming along, the whole thing's working kind of together. It's not the case that everything is connected to everything else, but the thing is massively interconnected. And so, you know, the normal brain is that these things are all on the go at the same time, contributing to supporting behavior, right? And that's contributing to supporting the creation of behavior in a real-time perceived context, right?
And maybe we've already covered, but does that lead nicely into saying then, what is this embodied cognition about? Because I think people come back and say, well, you're saying the brain's doing nothing.
No, the brain's clearly busy, right? You know, it's the same old thing, right? It's only this big, but it takes up 20% of your energy budget, right? It's clearly important, right? So embodied cognition is related to, well, embodied cognition is one of those terms for which there are a lot of different flavors, right? And there's the 2 big distinctions that we kind of point to are, there's the psychologists doing embodied cognition where they like to talk about our actions and our knowledge being grounded in metaphors, or our knowledge being grounded in metaphors about bodily states. So when we think about the future, we're looking forwards, we're leaning forwards, all those. And so the idea, if you get people to lean forward, they think about the future, and if they think about the future, they lean forward, and vice versa. So there's all that kind of stuff where it's kind of, you're trying to figure out a way of grounding the contents of abstract knowledge somehow in states of the body. Whatever, people do that, that's fine, they can knock themselves out. The notion of embodiment is not just that we have a body, but that whatever it is the brain is up to, it's part of a mobile organism that moves in certain ways and not other ways, that has access to information through some kinds of sensory systems. Right? I don't echolocate, I don't have sonar or any of those kinds of things, but I have vision and hearing and all those other sorts of things. And the idea is just to take some of that a bit seriously. And the idea is that we're fundamentally trying to explain why my behavior looks the way it does at any given moment in time. That's kind of what you want to do, right? So think about the Lampard clip. Like, why did he change his mind and go from passing to holding the ball, for example? Why did his behavior do one thing rather than any of the many possible options? And the idea, the embodied idea, is that the form of your behavior is emerging in real time from all these perceived affordances and your perceived environment and your response to those and your learned responses to those. And the goal of embodiment is just to take very seriously that behavior is not simply something that you tell the body to do, but that the body plays a very real part in creating, right? And that not just the body, but the body that moves in a certain way, that perceives some things and not other things. You know, Lampard's perceiving things about his environment that I would never perceive without extensive training, because he's had that practice. He's perceiving opportunities for behaviours that simply are almost literally invisible to me, right? And so embodiment's just about taking very seriously the fact that all of this is happening in real time with a real thing that's actually got some characteristics and can do some things and not other things, and that all of that matters, because those are all the things that are feeding into behaviour in the moment.
It just feels very relevant to sport, I think.
Yeah.
My journey into then reading into this, trying to get my head around it, is it just feels like a better fit for sport than some of the previous things I've sort of come across and thought about, just from my experiences. When you're looking, talk about expert players and how they do those things they do.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the things, actually, like as a scientist, one of the things I quite like about sports, it's like the analogy between engineering and physics, right? Engineering is where the rubber meets the road, where you take your physics theory and actually try and build something that works, right? And you know, here I am sitting in my lab doing work on body cognition, all that sort of stuff. But if I want to know if my ideas really work, right? Can I improve sporting performance? Can I explain sporting performance? Like that's where the rubber's really meeting the road. It's because in my day-to-day life, or in everyone's day-to-day lives, sort of the ways in which we interact with our environments, we 99.9% of the time we're operating well within our sort of safety margins, right? We're not pushing the system. But sports, sports is literally a situation where we are expecting people to be operating at their limits, right? And those limits get quite extreme, and the degree to which we expect people to be operating in them gets more and more the higher the level of the sport, right? Excuse me. So it's just an interesting place that really puts pressure on these theories, right? Like day-to-day behavior, like you might not be able to tell the difference between a few of these theories, but the cracks will really start to show if you put the pressure on. And so sports is a perfect place to go testing.
Yeah. Andrew, I'm really interested in putting a little pressure test on then. One of the things that feels like it's almost surfaced a few times, that's really interesting for where this theory sits in sport. And if I use a couple of the analogies we've had, so comparing, say, the quarterback to Frank Lampard, in that American football context, as we've discussed, there's maybe only one guy who truly is dynamically attuned to what's going on. The rest of them are following prescribed patterns. So we've maybe got very different roles, one versus the rest of the team. Absolutely. Whereas in the football context, you've got a team full of people who are highly attuned to emergent dynamics. But I'm really interested in, we've had a little bit of literature come out recently about the concept of shared affordances.
Yeah, I had a quick look at that.
In an expert team. I'm really curious about where that takes the theory, and if that's a comfortable extension of the theory into that space.
So yeah, I think it's a great extension of. So, I mean, affordances are tricky things, right? Affordances there's ongoing arguments about exactly how best to think about affordances, because they're a bit weird, right? Affordances are these opportunities for action. And the question is, well, how do you cash that out in a way that makes any kind of sense? And some people think that affordances are things that get created by your interaction with the environment, but the other kind of way of thinking about them is that affordances are actually, they're properties of the environment. They're things that are out there that the environment, and that environment can include other people and other organisms and things. But for me, the better approach is this latter approach of affordances as being properties of the task, right? There are things that are out there, and their form and their structure doesn't depend on me in any kind of critical way other than, but then my job is to come in and perceive those and then place myself through my behavior in a particular relation with those. And for my money, I'm just in a paper that I've just had out, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about this actually, that notion of affordances does everything that Gibson wanted them to be able to do, and then enables us to talk about things like, well, how do people interact with a common task, but coming at it from literally different places on the field, right? So flicking through the abstract, that paper you sent, so the idea of the shared affordances, you've got this team of people who are trying to achieve a common goal, but they're all operating towards a certain, towards a common goal, but they're not doing the same things in order to implement that goal, right? You have people with different roles and different places on the field, etc. Some of those roles, in football, it's a little bit less structured, maybe so than rugby. There's that kind of hierarchy, but there is some. No one's doing the same thing at the same time. That's just simply not how it works. Everyone's trying to complement actually one another. And so the question is, well, how do you tell a story about that? How do you get those people all on the same page? And one way to get them all on the same page is to give them all the same playbook, literally, of some kind, right? But then, well, what if that doesn't work? What in these more, these invasive sort of sports where it's more dynamic, more complicated? The affordance analysis, I think, would actually become very useful at that point. Because affordances, if they're properties of tasks, if they're things in the environment, and they're properties of the current task, what you then do is instead of training your 11 footballers to be able to all be thinking the same way or thinking about the same plays, what you do is you train them to be able to perceive the same task, right? And to be able to perceive the same opportunities, right? So one of the things that makes a really good team, like in football, is not just Frank Lampard, but Frank Lampard knowing that if he kicks the ball over there, he knows that someone else will have also seen that gap, for example. And that's when good teams click, and that's when good teams, that's what good teamwork is, right? It's that anticipation. It's anticipating others' goals, needs, etc. That's one way to talk about it. The other way to talk is that everyone's perceiving the same opportunities, but simply from just different locations on the field. And then they're coordinating their activity with respect to that perceived task environment. Now, having just done a fairly mammoth paper on the affordances of a target to be hit, thinking about the fact that it's taken me 5 years to do the data analysis on that paper and really, really nail the analysis, I don't actually even want to begin thinking about formally characterizing what in God's name the affordances of a football game are. That said, there are elements of a football game that you can start talking about in terms of, Lampard's evaluating apertures. Can he kick a ball through that, right? He's looking for gaps, but he's looking for gaps that will get the ball to a place that's a useful location relative to the goal he's aiming for. And so he's perceiving those gaps and those opportunities, and he's also counting on the fact that his teammates are also perceiving those gaps and opportunities, and he doesn't have to communicate to them what to do. They're responding to the same task, using the same information about the same things, and that's why they all end up doing the same thing. It's not that they're on the same play because they thought about it the same way. It's that they're literally just perceiving the same game, right? So that there is a mindset that I like the shared affordances idea, at least as a framework, right? Getting formal about it and getting very serious and rigorous about the affordances, that's a big job. But just as a mindset, right? This is one of the big things. Mark, you've mentioned this as well. Just flagging out the idea that this is a shift in your thinking and your framing of the problem. The shift is that you're not trying to get the team to think the same. You're trying to create a team that perceives the game the same way, right? And that's so that they're all perceiving. So right, think about right. Pull Lampard out and stick me in. Right? The rest of the team is still doing their thing. And here I am. I'm literally perceiving a different football game from them. Literally. There are opportunities that I simply literally do not perceive because I just don't have that experience and that exposure. So all of a sudden I'm a problem. Not because maybe I've learned their game book, right? Maybe I can go and do that. But I'm a problem not because I don't know the moves. I'm a problem because I'm not seeing the same game they are. And if I don't see the same game, then I'm making decisions that are different from theirs. Right, and I'm responding to different task demands. So the reason I like the shared affordances idea is that it gives you a way of talking about how all these people can suddenly mysteriously organize their behavior as if they're all doing the same thing. Well, they are all doing the same thing in a very deep, meaningful way.
And I think the theory is the coordination level, so Keith Davids and Dwight Arai who did that paper. It's all coordinating with information, isn't it? So the ability to intercept a ball, first touch, or to strike a ball,
Yep.
Information to coordinate your own body parts to hopefully effectively control or strike that ball. So it's information. But we're now talking inter-individual level as well, where it's that information allows us to coordinate collectively. So it's no longer body parts, it's actually a group of people who are coordinating their actions around receiving information in a similar way and the opportunities or affordances it offers.
I mean, one of the things about this notion of information and perception that it gives you is it solves one of the big problems in psychology, where if I show you an object from one angle and then show it to you from a different angle, right, it projects a completely different image on the back of the eye. And for the longest time, like this shape constancy idea just confused people. Like, how can you possibly solve it? And it turns out, well, the shape of the thing on the back of the retina is not how you perceive the shape of something, right? What you're perceiving is the dynamic properties of this thing, right? You're perceiving that it has certain characteristics as it moves. And scale that up to a football game. A football game moves and changes in particular ways and ebbs and flows in very particular ways that are quite complicated and very high dimensional and very sort of complicated. But a person standing here and a person standing here they're not seeing the same game in terms of, if they were video cameras, they would be getting a different vantage point on the game. But the point is, that's not the point, right? They're seeing the same game because the kind of information that we have access to use gives us information not about what the world looks like from a particular point of view, but what the task looks like as a whole, right? Because, yeah, that sounds a little waffly, but it's the idea that because you're perceiving the dynamics, the way things change, and the organized and orderly way in which things change, then you can get access to that from literally a bunch of different vantage points, as long as you've got access to the right information, and you get that by learning and experience, right? And these footballers are literally experiencing the same game, even though they're not standing in the same place or doing the same actions, right? The notion of sameness is more interesting than that.
I think that's really nice. It might be a nice takeaway point for any coaches that are watching. I'm sure it's a nice familiar concept, at least to coach, the idea that they want all the players to see the same game. But really just how we then create the right learning environment for them to maximise their ability to do that is probably a question for another time, but probably a very fruitful path to follow.
I hope so. I mean, how and why skills transfer. It's funny. Like, I've gotten into this recently, and the literature it's real. Like, people really don't know how to predict how skills transfer. People have been studying the transfer of skills for a long time, and as I've gotten into this and started looking, like, people go after the fact. They go, oh, skills transferred. Oh, well, clearly that's because these things are similar. They couldn't predict it ahead of time, right? And that's what, like, I've got some empirical work that I'm starting to do using a very simple task where we're starting to try and figure out ways of predicting and explaining transfer ahead of time, effectively, with some success, I think, but it's still complicated and we're still dealing with very simple tasks. But honestly, the focus is on information, right? The trick is transfer follows the information, right? Why? Because learning it's not about learning the execution of the skill per se, it's about learning to organize your behavior with respect to information. And if you have access to that information, then that information can draw the behavior out of you. And so, yeah, we have a long way to go before we can really kind of tell that bigger picture story and start relating it to more interesting tasks. But we're just now getting into it. But the basic principle is that skills will transfer between two contexts, to the extent that those contexts offer the same opportunities and the same information about those opportunities. If they do, you should expect good transfer. So, Dan Carter, why is he such a good kicker of the ball from kicking his penalties and all that sort of stuff? Because it's a nice task that he was able to practice over and over again in his backyard for as long as he can remember, right? But he didn't, and so there was good overlap, right? That transferred because it's that nice, stable sort of scenario where he's able to do that. But he didn't just practice passing the ball in his backyard. There's lots of different things that he had to do in order to be able to be the amazing sort of number 10 that he was, in terms of being able to decide when to pass the ball, how to pass the ball, all those kinds of things. He needed exposure to contexts that provided him with opportunities and information to perceive those, and he had to learn how to perceive those so that when they arose, he had some behaviors sort of ready to go and ready to be pulled out of him. So, the basic principle is, things will transfer to the extent that there's information in common, and that means identifying those opportunities, right? Information for what? Information for affordances.
Yeah. And Andrew, maybe to finish, be interested in your thoughts if there's people watching, particularly students who are maybe interested in doing some research and maybe what we've talked about today sort of captured their attention. What do you think would be the good next step in like a sports skills context? So you've just done a throwing paper.
Yeah.
But what do you think in this area would be the good next line of or extension for some research in sport?
I mean, so the throwing stuff that we're doing, the reason why we're doing it, one of the reasons why we're doing it is that it's cool and really interesting just in and of itself. But the other reason we're doing it is that we're able to tell a fairly rigorous affordance story on a fairly complicated movement. And so the reason we're able to do that is that at the end of the day, when you're trying to do a throw, you're just trying to produce a projectile motion, right? You're just trying to produce a particular kind of motion of the ball so that it intercepts a target or travels for a maximum distance or whatever. But there's all kinds of other things that happen in, say, a sporting context that are similar, right? So kicking, for example, a kick is just another way of producing a projectile motion that has to do certain things, right? So actually, there's a whole sort of you could apply the affordance analysis that I just did on throwing to a target. You could use that same basic framework on kicking to a target, and then our next move is to actually start looking in more detail at how people actually execute those throws. Now that we know what it is they're trying to achieve. In terms of the target, we can actually now go backwards and actually we're going to do some full body motion capture and actually really get to grips with how people are executing that action, and can we identify how they're controlling that action as it unfolds over time. You know, the same opportunities arise with kicking, but like there's a million and one different tasks. The real trick is you have to kind of get it to a point where you can, if you're going to do research on it, you do have to do that thing which is tricky, which is break it down a little bit and identify sort of a particular thing. You have to identify a particular task that you want to understand, and you know, within sporting context, I mean, there's a bunch of different things you could look at. Yeah, I don't know, like it's kind of, you know, within football, right? How do you make that decision when to kick, when not to kick, right? So the dynamics of how you interact with a dynamically changing gap, right? There's an initial literature on that, not in a sporting context, but just interested in how people locomote through those, or try to throw something through it, or throw for someone to catch it. You know, there's the how do you avoid problem, right, which is just the flip side of that same analysis. So there's lots of pieces that live in the sort of the basic research field that could very easily and should be getting translated into the sporting context, I think.
Absolutely, we've spoken about it. That's one that's interesting for me, is that gap. Perception, and there's been some work in driving as well as in rugby and simulation about passing through a gap in terms of locomoting through. But interesting, what are the similarities or differences if it's actually to project an object, i.e. a ball, through that gap? Is it the same dynamics, or are there differences? And that's maybe where there isn't really anything at the moment, is there?
No, not a huge amount that I know of. But the thing is, there's like a lot of the tools are there, a lot of the theoretical tools are there. So the issue is, look, if anyone's interested in trying to identify these research questions, get in touch with someone like me, or there's Rob Gray, who's at Arizona. He does an excellent podcast actually, but he's a perception action kind of person, and he's very explicitly interested in sporting things. We're actually, hopefully, we'll be doing some work together soon on throwing, but just what we've got is that big picture view of the literature where somebody comes to us with a particular problem and we go, well, I know that we've got this on the shelf, and we know we've got this on the shelf, and we've got this on the shelf, and we can apply those tools to answer that particular question. We can also sort of try and fine-tune the I want to just measure the production of throwing. I want to understand why the throw was produced one way rather than all the possible other ways it was produced. And that means understanding things about the task, and the task of throwing is to produce a particular kind of motion. What kind of motion? Well, it depends. Are you throwing to a target? If so, how far away is that target? And so on and so forth. So we, we all come to this with the bigger question, and then you turn it into pieces that you can study with one eye on trying to put it all back together again at the end. But there's a lot of pieces in the literature, tools, methods, analyses, ways of thinking about these problems that exist, but not a lot of work done bringing it together to apply it to something like something really quite complicated, taking it out of the lab. It's sports as a context in which we're going to be able to start taking some of these pieces and really tie them together in a way that we don't in the lab so much.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, hopefully we've spark someone's imagination to maybe undertake that task, and they'll get in touch, Andrew. And I think that pretty much wraps us up. I'm conscious of time. Al, is there anything?
Yeah, I think that's been really interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
For this, yeah, it's been really interesting. It's nice to keep these conversations going.
Absolutely, mate. So I'm sure we might have another chat sometime in the future, but as we publish this, we'll invite you through Twitter, I'm sure, to engage in some more discussion that's likely to come up. But until then, all right. Cheers, Andrew. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Bye.
Bye.